Fala, turma! Tallis Gomes aqui, meu co-host Matt, e esse é mais um Vox Luminis podcast, e como sempre, trazendo para vocês um convidado que a gente considera super bacana, que dá para ter uma conversa profunda sobre empreendedorismo, filosofia de vida e aquele negócio que eu gosto muito, viu? Montanhas, porque hoje o meu convidado aqui, e eu vou mudar para a língua dele, it's Mr. Hap Klopp, the co-founder of North Face, one of the most prominent, if not the most important brand for adventure people. It's here in G4. Thank you for coming, Mr. Klopp.
Thank you for having me.
Well, me and Matt, we was super thrilled to this talk because I'm passionate about mountains. I was talking to you a little bit brief before we start this podcast here. I was like three weeks ago doing heli ski, and usually I go 5-6 times to mountains during my year. I love snow adventures, man.
Fantastic. I love it too.
And you know what? I was reading something before I start this podcast with you, that you were the one who introduced it to the market, the technology, the Gore-Tex technology, right?
That's correct.
It was in the 60s?
It was in the late 60s. Actually, 60s. We used it when we launched our ski line. And we used it for what was called extreme gear at that time. And
that's amazing because it's breathable. Yeah. It's not heavy.
Yeah. It also stops the wind. Which is great, as you know. If you're skiing, you know, the wind can be the thing that chills you and it makes the worst thing. So because it's waterproof, breathable, and we found a perfect application for it. I mean, the reality is what we did is we wanted a differentiation when we launched our company, and the idea was we focused on people doing extreme skiing. We started something called extreme gear, but the people were doing flips off of mountains and things, and what they wanted was clothing that was not bulky. If you think of North Face, you often think of bulky down jackets. They said, that encumbers us. So what we did is by using Gore-Tex, we were able to make a jacket that was fairly close fitting, but stopped the wind so they could be reasonably warm, but they could do all of the acrobatics and flexibility.
Definitely. I mean, some of them super light and super warm, right? But anyway, I want to give 2 steps back and start by the beginning. I know that you probably tired to say the same things, the same history, but I want to give it context to the Brazilian audience, because as long as I know, it's your first time in Brazil, right?
Correct.
So I never had the chance to talk to the Brazilian audience, at least here in Brazil. And my idea is to have you telling us a little bit about the history of the beginning of the North Face and the motivation behind to create this company.
Well, it's a lengthy story, and I'll try to truncate it somewhat. But the reality is I couldn't work for anybody else. I had idiosyncratic ideas. I didn't like the way business was. I had a good background in terms of that. I'd had a background in running a family company because my father had died while I was in school. And so I was in school. I was running the family company, made wood windows and frames, a sash and door. And I was also getting my degree at Stanford. I have an MBA and an AB from Stanford University. So I had some business training and background, and my father died, so I was running the company, but I sold the company because it didn't really meet what I wanted to do. And so then, after having some really difficult interviews with companies, because I thought I should be running them, and I don't think they thought I should be running them, what I decided is, well, if you can't work for anybody else, start your own company. And started about something And I'd grown up in the outdoors. I grew up near the Canadian border of the U.S., and what we did all the time was, ski, hike, camp, kayak, fly fish, whatever. And as a result, I loved that. And I loved it not only from the activity, but I loved the transformation that came about by being in the wilderness. And I had an overriding thing, and I really wanted to change the world. That was my concept. I wanted to change the world because the world was so screwed up. And among other things, people were ruining the wilderness, even at that time. Obviously, it's gotten much worse. And what I'd found from my own personal experience and from my reading was that the deeper people got into the wilderness, the more they got away from urban problems. And they came back better stewards of the earth. They came back rejuvenated. And in the 60s, it was a difficult time in the U.S. And we had the Vietnam War, and we had...
I don't remember, but I read about it.
Well, but it was. And it's in some ways similar to what we have today with chaos and things around the globe. And if people focused on that, it's just negative. And what I knew is, from a personal standpoint, if you get away and enjoy it, it's great. So we started out focusing initially on camping, with the dream that I had that we would change the world by sending people deep into the wilderness. And when they went there, they'd have the same transformational experience I had. They'd come back, one, they'd be rejuvenated, but second of all, they would realize there's an appreciation for protecting the earth, and they would do that. And so what we did was, as the pain point we were trying to solve, I was trying to solve, was how do you get people back deeper into the wilderness, not just off the side of the road. And we did it by making lightweight equipment. And our initial step was to take materials from the Vietnam War and repurpose them. We took aircraft aluminum and made tent poles and pack frames. We took parachute cloth and we made sleeping bags and tents, clothing, funky clothing, to be honest, but we were able to do that. We lightened the load that people carried by 50%, and then suddenly it was not a beast of burden act any longer. Amazing. People would go out there. And so by doing that, we always made it quality. As somebody who'd been in the out of doors all the time, as you would probably expect, you don't want your product to fail. And if your product fails, your life depends on it. So we made a product that never failed, and we put a lifetime warranty on it. And all the sort of business people, particularly the accountants, said, "You're crazy, you can't do that." But from that standpoint, I knew how important that was to the people who worked in that market. The other part of it tied into my environmental concerns, which was, if a product never fails, it never goes into the landfill. So it really worked from both ways. And so we did that. And the idea was to encourage outdoor activities with the response that you'd get from that. And then we continued to expand to various areas. We used sort of the influencer model, which is effectively these consumer markets are pyramid shaped. And at the top are the influencers. We sort of started with the mountaineers, people climbing Everest or whatever. Behind that was sort of backpacking. Behind that was secondary users, people. Sometimes they were skiers, sometimes they're mountain bikers, sometimes they're kayakers, sometimes they're outdoor. And below that were kind of people who love sport, but maybe not into it. And below that is probably just the mass market, people looking at fashion. And what we did and what utilized all the time was effectively trying to influence the influencer. Everybody on that pyramid knows where they are, and they look to the people above them for product suggestions, for ratification. So we just focused on making products for the people who influence the market, and then from there allowed that to be using word of mouth and using our techniques to be able to expand storytelling as a way to expand.
Amazing. I can see that you were a product guy, right?
Yeah.
Because you were probably taking care of the product. And I know by fact that you bought a small store from a couple, and then transformed this small store in what it is today, the North Face. Do you think that the biggest differential that you brought to North Face at that time when you bought this store is to start to building these innovative products?
Some was innovative product, but it was innovation all the way across the line. I mean, when we had our first store launch, we brought in the musical group called the Grateful Dead. Unknown at that time, but the Grateful Dead were part of our activity, and Joan Baez was there, and Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who is this famous poet that existed there, and then there were skiers, and then there were hikers and climbers. Part of it is being differentiated. People, that's what we were trying to do. So not only was our product differentiated, but our business model was differentiated. The people we associated with the company were differentiated, and I believe in building a brand. I wanted to build a brand from day one, and because a brand lasts forever. Products have a life cycle.
That's interesting because, as you say, brands last forever. It's kind of the culture that you try to apply to your own products, right?
Yeah.
So something that's interesting talking about that. North Face is known by having a strong culture. How this vision of company shaped this culture of North Face?
Well, a brand is a culture. A brand isn't a product. A brand isn't just a logo. It isn't just a tagline. We had a great tagline, "Never Stop Exploring," which I think has all sorts of implications and things. But what we were trying to do is create a community. That's what brands are about, a community of like-minded people. And probably the first thing, and talking with a few people in Brazil that recently, they said, but you took some of these positions, wasn't that crazy? Like we opposed the Vietnam War. We took positions where
that position against the Vietnam War was in a certain time that it was hard to talk about that in US in general speaking.
It could be considered anti-America.
Yeah,
this,
exactly,
right?
and
it was brave.
Yeah, and right after I don't know if I will put in the timeline correctly, but right after you had that free speech movement from Berkeley also, right? So a lot of stuff happening in that time, a lot of movements in that region. So do you believe that those movements also helped to shape the brand?
Oh, for sure. I mean, some of it is it made us stand out. We didn't do it just to stand out. We did it because we firmly believed in it. We believed there needed to be changes. And I'm not talking just about the anti-war movement, but the environmental movement. We were early believers in ESG even before people knew what the letters meant. And, that, again, alienated people out there. Yes. And, from the standpoint of what we're doing. But the idea is that we didn't want to sell everybody, but we wanted to sell the people who believed what we did. Okay. And it wasn't as foolish as it might sound because sure, it was a small number of people initially, but we felt, I believed, that the winds of change were behind us. The mega trends were behind us. That's where things are going to go. And I thought it would maybe happen sooner than it did, but you see today reflected across a lot of things, whether it's apparel or consumer goods or automobiles that are going to electric or whatever, that what we were seeing was in fact the idea going forward. Now, the one thing I've told some people is we were futurists. I was a futurist, and I could see the world pretty clearly. Missed some of it. Yes. For example, I thought sustainability was the end all, and really believed in sustainability, lifetime warranty, and product lasts there. The reality is circularity is actually more important than sustainability. Sustainability is only a segment of it. Yes. And if you look at what North Face does now, they sell millions of units of product which are petroleum based. They might have goose down in them or whatever. Had I seen a little bit further out there, maybe I would have tried to find materials that were more environmentally friendly or whatever. We maybe would have designed products so they would have been easier to disassemble if you wanted to do that.
Even though that hurt at the margins, do you think that they should pursue this way, like find a material that will be more sustainable? Even though it could hurt the margins in the first time?
Yeah, it might be longer to adopt. There's a product adoption cycle. It's a bell-shaped curve, and the more strange your product is, the more differentiated, the longer it is to accept. Now, it was kind of okay when I started the company because it was a sleepy time. Yeah. I mean, the pace of society now is so much faster than when I started the North Face. So we had time to evolve. It was going to take another couple of years, whatever, as long as we could drink beer and have fun and be around. We loved the people that were using our products. We were inspired by them. So we didn't have to worry about it. If you launched today and had sort of that laissez-faire approach that I had, probably it'd be foolish. But I was lucky.
Okay. You know what? I would like to go through that because I really admire your generation, because your generation basically built the foundations to my generation to work on. I mean, everything that we do nowadays, you guys built it back then, like the work environment. I would like to go through the work environment that you had in the 70s, for example, when it was like booming with North Face, transforming this brand, this such a cool brand in a massive chain all over the United States. How was the days where you were like growing 30, 50, 100% a month? Tell me a little bit about the days and how the work environment looks like.
Just craziness.
Well, I mean, it's obvious, or at least obvious to me, that when you have that sort of environment, it's really energizing. Everybody's jacked up. Everybody, wow, they're doing things. And the idea that never appealed to me, but the idea of growing 4 or 5% a year, so what? You know that's inflation, if you will. But but when you revolutionize the world, you can attract a lot of people to you. And with our idiosyncratic ideas of wanting to change the world, that drew a lot of people in because we were doing things. We're putting new materials in that nobody ever thought. When our tent sales slowed down, I went to a gentleman by the name of Buckminster Fuller, and Bucky Fuller was one of the geniuses of all time. If you look back there's things on the table of elements right now dedicated to him that he discovered. But he had this idea that math was inherently wrong. He said, I've studied it, and he said, math should be, every number should be discrete. And the numbers are not discrete, 1 or 2 or whatever. He said, if I look at pi, trying to calculate the area inside a circle, it's 3.1514. If I use the area in calculus under a line, use 1.414. He said, that doesn't work. So he set about finding a new math, and that new math was based on looking at nature. And in nature, he found every single number that exists in our system is there in a discrete form. A triangle is 1, a rectangle is 2, and you can build every number.
Seriously?
He then used that to come up with a new structures predicated on having more triangles. They intersect. He created something known as a geodesic structure, geodesic domes.
Geodesic domes.
Right, and tensegrity and whatever. And it's the only physical structure that the larger it gets, the stronger it gets. Because what you do is vector forces into more and more triangles. And the more triangles you have, the stronger it is. And that the triangle being the single element of nature. He did many other things. I mean, he invented the first car that was absolutely fuel efficient, had a tiller that did that, and I mean, he was a thinker. I mean, I've talked with him. I said, how do you come up with all these ideas? He said, well, all you do is just study all knowledge from history forward.
Just that.
Yeah. So, okay, well, that's kind of daunting. But anyway, so I went to him and I said, Bucky, you talk about your structure encompassing the maximum amount of space with a minimum amount of materials. I said, that sounds like a tent to me. Yeah. And he said, oh, for sure, it could be. And I said, well, would you design one? He said, well, unfortunately, I don't have much time. I'm changing the world. But if you put a team together, I would love to mentor that team. Now, and we had a lot of people who were kind of Bucky followers or whatever, so it was easy to put a team together. But going back to your initial question about the environment, you put a team together working with one of the most brilliant people in the world that had ever existed, and you create that environment. And then you do it in different ways. And then we're around these crazy athletes who are doing things that nobody would think of, not only climbing Mount Everest, because some people think about that, but one, Ned Gillette, rowed a boat from the tip of South America, from Point Arenas to the Antarctic. He rowed a boat across that, and some of the these others are doing crazy things. So you get energized by that sort of thing, and then the music community existed around there. Our factory was right next door to a band called the Creedence Clearwater Revival, and so it's doing that. So you have the Grateful Dead, Creedence Clearwater. You have these crazy people climbing there. You're with some of the the brightest people, or one of the brightest people that ever existed, and you put all that together, and you have this milieu that is incomparable. And all of that goes to building the brand. I mean, you use all the tools. You have a logo and you have a tagline. You use storytelling, use word of mouth. But within that, you have an environment that's incomparable that makes it so energizing. And we had things because of my personal belief, but we hired anybody. We hired gay, lesbian, we had transgender. Why not? And we hired people from outside the country who spoke 14 languages at all times. We had such a unique environment, and people liked what we were doing. We became the employer of choice. We didn't have to go out looking for people. People came to us. They said, we like the way
That's amazing.
Yeah, and they liked the product, and we liked our commitment to the environment.
Okay, and let me ask you something. How long do you think that you worked back then? I mean, you used to stay like 10 hours in the office, 12 hours in the office. How hard you guys worked back then when it was like building the company?
Well, it depends what you call work. For example, we would finish long days. I usually get there about 4:30 in the morning, but
when to get out.
But at the end of the day, I mean, first of all, when we use the products, is that working or not using? We're testing the product. Well, one could argue there. I got my family involved in it. Sometimes, crazy. We were rafting down the Colorado River, and my wife ended up in the river in the first 10 seconds we're on the river, and then she said, "Now I've got 8 more days of this." Don't worry, it'll be great. It gets easier. It gets better. better. But maybe that's work. And we like drinking beer and whatever. But at the end of days, rather than just go home, we get together and have beers and talk about life, beer,
Amazing.
work, and we'd come up with ideas. And I'll give you one idea that we came up with, which really worked well, and it was a byproduct of bullshitting really more than what we were doing. But we got together and we were talking about it. We said, we're making a big mistake. What we're doing is spending so much of our time trying to get subpar workers up to par, and almost at the level of ignoring the best people. That's backwards. We shouldn't be doing it. So we said, we've got to do something. We got to come up with a new idea. So we didn't have much money, and then we said, but how can we do it? Well, the worst job in our factory really was the last roll on the production line. It was trimming threads. All day long you trim threads, but it was our last quality control point. So it was an essential thing, but a tedious job, one I'd never do. And they have these little trimmers and whatever. We said, how about we take some of those trimmers that have gotten dull, we just bronze them. I'll write a poem or something and put it on this plaque saying, you're great people, I love you. And we will put that up there, and then we'll give it out to a few of these workers who are working so hard. Frankly, we don't need it at once, but the idea was acknowledging. About 3 or 4 years after that, I was invited to the home of one of the people who had gotten their citizenship paper, Gloria Nabelik. And she said, you have to come to celebrate. And we went to her home to celebrate. We're drinking Slivovitz and some other things. That's cool. It was there and enjoying and celebrating becoming a citizen. But I looked up on her mantle above her fire, and there was this plaque that was what we called the Golden Trimmer Award. And, that sort of, to be able to recognize it, frankly, had I realized it was going to last that long, I might have spent a little more time both on the poem I put together and on the award that we did. But it was that sort of thing. And that spawned from these extra hours we spent, which, we were having fun because we were drinking beer and laughing and whatever.
But you were in the work environment discussing philosophy of life, philosophy of the brand, discussing ideas. And everyone was involved in that, right?
Yeah.
Back then, how many people you guys were in the brand?
Well, we started with 14 people.
14?
Yeah. But
the middle 70s, you were in that.
No. Right? And then we were probably up to about 300, 400.
Okay.
And then we moved to 1,000, and then we moved to a couple of thousand or whatever.
That's pretty challenging, right?
Sure.
I have 400 employees nowadays here, and I pass together with my business partner through all the way from 1 to 400, and each 50 that you add in the company changes everything, the way you create the product, the way you create the processes, the way people relate with each other. What are the main, if you could cherry picking some advices to the entrepreneurs that are hearing us in this podcast today, what are the main suggestions that you have to the CEOs when they are growing fast in people? What are the concerns that they have to do? And what are the things that you remember that you did back in the days in North Face when it was to, 50 to 400 that you think that the entrepreneurs should follow your lead in what you did?
Well, I don't know if I ever recommend anybody follow what I did, but I can tell you what we did. That's different. But the first thing is try and keep it simple. Because if you're trying to convey a message, the more complex it gets, the harder it is to remember. And the simple thing which I came up with, which we did, was, as I said, a brand is a DNA. Brand isn't a product. Brand isn't a label. Brand is all those things, but more than that. It's your DNA, what you stand for. So I distilled it down to 3 words. One word was quality, another one was disruption, and another one was triple bottom line. Equal commitment to people and the planet and the profit and whatever. And the idea was to talk about that and make sure it cut across every activity we had in the company. So when we were disruptive, it was not only product, but we were disruptive in our business model. We were omni-channel day one. We sold retail, we sold on catalog, later became e-commerce, and we also sold wholesale. People said you couldn't do that. You're competing against yourself or whatever. Said no.
It's challenge, right?
Yeah. And you're challenged, but the idea was to put all of those out there. We would do those words, and I won't bore you with all of the details associated with it, but the idea was to then develop stories around it and then have those stories told to consumers, to employees, to vendors, to all the stakeholders that you have. In doing that, everybody comes up with a consistent view of what you are. And we would hold a meeting every 2 years. We called it long-range planning, but it was basically trying to set the course of the company for the next 5 years, but heavy focus on the next 2 years. And we would do that. We're adding all these people, as you talked about, and each person coming on had some interpretation of who we were.
Okay. Yeah.
And it may be right, may be wrong, but the idea is we had to level set everybody coming back to where we were. So we'd hold this meeting every couple of years. It was very boring to some people who've been around for a while. Say, why are we talking about qualitative things? Why are we talking about disruption or bottom line?
Because they heard that so many times, right?
Yeah. But the new people needed to know the same thing other people did. And one of the key things, which I did at the end of all of these, was the same comment, which again, for the people who've been around was kind of boring, but for the people who hadn't been around was startling. And I said, okay, now that we've decided all of these things about what we stand for, we've got the numbers, we know sales and margins and whatever, but the more important things are what we stand for, what are qualitative things. And I said, now that we've all agreed on this, I hope that we're clear enough that some of you now leave. Because if you have a different view, we can't have you around here. We hired you not because anything other than we thought you were great. But if you have a different way to do business, that's fine, but you can't do that here. There's many ways to run a business, but any business can only run it one way. So it was coming back to, how do we get everybody level set? Some people left after that. Some people left and came back. But it was trying to get people with that same view, because otherwise you can go in this direction and that direction. And that doesn't mean that you aren't looking for new ideas and new inspiration that come from those people.
Of course.
You are, but when it comes down to the simple basics of what you stand for, you have to be consistent, persistent all the way along the line. And as an example of that, the North Face logo has only had one change since the beginning in 1968. And that one change is, in some applications, there's a rectangle put around the logo, because the logo is a little clunky in some application. Put it on the front of a store, you need something. So we put a geometric background around, and the geometry would work graphically and aesthetically. But we didn't want to change that. Now, the obverse of that, I believe, is just how Facebook and Google have really screwed it up. I mean, you got Meta, you got Alphabet. They've thrown away hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars of equity, response, belief from their customers to come up with something new. Now, they can argue, well, we were a product initially and we have to be another product. Well, maybe they should have thought about it at the outset. Or, candidly, couldn't you evolve that so it had a broader thing? The reality is the emotional bond that many of the people had to the company was broken. And now either they're going to have to spend a lot more money to do it, or they're going to see the passion dissipated, all of those things.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Can I say then, regarding what you're teaching here, that once you have your culture, you have basically a framework throughout the decisions is gonna be taken, and then you gotta consistently tell what is this culture means to the new people, even though the old people in the company gonna be bored to hear the same thing, but you gotta keep yourself disciplined to tell the same thing over and over again to make sure that everyone understands what the company really is. Is that right?
Absolutely. And as you said, at times it can be a little repetitive to people that have been there before, but because they say we know it, whatever. It's actually, maybe they don't know. It's good to refresh.
Maybe they
sometimes.
say that they know, right?
Yeah, because you can be distracted by the newest shiniest object that ever shows up and look that way, or directed, and you can see somebody having some success and say, why don't we, have you thought about doing it in that way? But you need to do that to be a brand, and that's what we wanted to be, because a brand is a value. Brand is a differentiator. Brand is what brings people back to you. And if not, it's very expensive. You want to bring the customer back, because it costs 5 times as much to get a new customer as an old customer. So why not do that? On top of that, brand, which is registration around a logo or a tagline, is much more defensible than around a patent or around an idea or a concept, because you can do that around the globe. And so if you spend a lot of time and equity in developing it, if somebody tries to knock it off, you have easy legal recourse against them.
Yes, that makes sense.
And how to keep those old team members inspired on the long term? Because we start to listen the same thing over and over again, but how to keep them motivated to do their work, to keep inspired and keep pressing on and doing awesome stuff during a long period.
Well, it's a great question, but I think the answer is we were very lucky. One of it is that our products and our activities and the expansion of categories we went into was naturally very exciting to those people. So it's the principles behind it that remained the same. But one, you change the tools that you're using to execute. So suddenly things come in, and more recently it's things like design thinking or agile software or lean startup management. But you have that sort of thing as you're approaching it. We would go into new areas. So we expanded from mountaineering into backpacking to skiing to trail running. We started getting those. That became interesting to a lot of people to be able to do it. So, so instead of just the philosophy being consistent and everything else being consistent, the daily activity was different. And then moving geographically, I mean, we were lucky because it was a slower time, as we talked about, and you could expand geographically sort of sequentially. You didn't have to rush to it. Today, every company is more global.
Yes.
And so you have to register globally, and you're probably day one, you're selling across international borders or whatever. Yes. But we sort of grew from West Coast to East Coast to North America and Europe and Japan and South America later on. And in doing that, every time we went into a new geographical area, that was pretty exciting to somebody, and we could do things about that. And that, as we talked about earlier, if you are around all these wacky people, whether it's the geniuses like Bucky Fuller, whether it's a guy rowing from the tip of South America to the Antarctic, or somebody who's climbing Mount Everest, being around those people is pretty exciting. And so it removes the, I wouldn't say dullness, but it removes the repetitive concern. And then the challenge is, don't get lost in all of that. Let's go back to what we stand for.
Yeah, you know what? Well, back then, you didn't have the advent of internet. So it was pretty hard. I believe that was pretty hard to grow businesses as fast as you guys grow. Because nowadays, if I have a lot of money, let's say that I don't know, I had a fundraising, and then somebody threw like hundreds of millions of dollars in my company, I can invest 50% of this in growth, like basically transferring this funding to Mark Zuckerberg and Larry Page, and flood the world with my brand and create a huge pipeline of leads to my businesses, right? Back then, we didn't have this. You had radio, you had TV, which was too expensive for a new brand. Right. How did you manage to grow the brand without the money to invest in TV or radio or the things? What was the strategy behind the early days growth in North Face?
Well, first of all, it's harder now than when I started.
Do you think
the
so?
reason it's
because
harder
of the competition.
Because there's so much competition. We're just saturated with media. We're saturated with products and services. We're saturated with companies out there. We're saturated with global competition. And we try to do all of those things. Where are you on social media? You're on TikTok. You're on Amazon. You're on LinkedIn or whatever.
So many channels, right?
And so getting it all together and being one company is difficult. Because we had so few channels, it was easier to be able to do that. What we relied on is going back to what I talked about in terms of that pyramid, and that is we used word of mouth. And we use word of mouth. And there's tools today that people should use called growth hacking. I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but basically it's how you can't afford to do maybe all the global work you're doing, so you try to hack into somebody's network. So you combine with somebody who is complementary to you, and you utilize that to be able to expand. That's sometimes influencers. This is the idea of doing that. If they have 1 million followers and their DNA is in accord with that, it works. But we would use people that other people followed. And then what we would do is be aware of, if we did these really exotic things, we could have put products on people that would end up in media. For example, there was a ski organization called Warren Miller, and they did these films every year. And because the people we were sponsoring were doing these crazy things, they were naturally in Warren Miller's thing. And all we had to do was provide gear to some of those people.
Really?
And they would show up in those. They'd be on the cover of magazines or whatever. So by being able to do that, and this is kind of the concept of growth hacking too, to be able to get paid media. We would do experiential things that became stories in and of themselves that then would be told by other people, and frankly had more credibility.
Yes.
You know, if I tell you something about North Face, you kind of think I'm a homie. Of course I'm going to say that.
Yeah,
Sure.
When you tell somebody, you said, yeah, he was talking with Hap, he kind of does that.
As you did right on the beginning,
It
for
is.
example.
It is.
Yeah.
But when it gets to the third person that you've told, it's almost a fact.
Yes.
You know, what I'm saying is there. I have a lot of credibility, and it isn't just me selling something, you know, because we're all sort of resistant to sales pitch. I mean, we hear them, we know it's a sales pitch.
Yes.
And what's the first thing you say in the store when people come in? Can I help you?
Yeah.
The second thing you say is, no, I'm just looking.
Yes,
You know,
that's it.
except the reason I'm in the store is I may want to buy something, but I don't want to be sold.
Yeah.
And so by using media or things that get out there, and we would come up with experiential events, either through the athletes we worked with or whatever. I mean, at one point, we sponsored a march across the United States where people were against the war effort, and we gave 1,000 tents away. And they marched the entire width of the country, which is pretty large. And all of these colorful tents showed up, and it was there. Well, there was media talking about that and what they were doing, and it didn't talk.
That was genius.
Yeah, and you know, we would do it and other things, you know, like Creedence Clearwater. We get involved in whatever they were doing to bring them in, and working with Buckminster Fuller, who has this whole strange following of people being out there. So we were looking experiential as a way of creating something that would then be newsworthy, so others would do that would expand on those channels that are out there. And if somebody else was talking about it, it was more impactful than the ads we had.
Yeah, that makes sense, because you know what? When I think about North Face, I can see something more than a sports brand. I see a philosophy of life. I see a lifestyle.
Yeah.
So probably people like me, they want to use brands that shows the philosophy of life that they agreed on. Like, I'm an adventure person. I like mountains and everything. And I totally use on my daily basis sometimes North Face.
Yeah.
Because it tells something about me. Right? So when you change it to be only a sports brand and you became an apparel, so you go to fashion, you kind of do this transition and allow other people to embed themselves with your values and say, hey, I'm an adventure person as well, right?
Absolutely. Well, if you look at the tagline, it addresses the point you're talking about. What we said is never stop exploring.
Yes.
Now, on one level, you could see that totally around athletes. You can look at mountaineers, or you can look at explorers going somewhere, or everybody explores every single day, some in the urban environment, somewhere else. So we wanted to tie into that. And I always joke about the fact, and you being a skier, you'd relate to this. You know, there's a face that you ski.
Yes.
The face is the same whether you're starting skiing or whether you're an expert heli skier.
Yeah.
You know, the steepness is the only thing that changed, but the adrenaline rush, the enthusiasm that comes with it is the same.
Yes.
And what we tried to stay away from appearing judgmental. Like, okay, we're better than you because we're better skiers, or we're better than you because we climb the best mountains. We wanted to transcend the joy of the activities we were doing. The reason that people got involved in it was a few people got involved in it to be the best. And some of that drive is maybe to go to the top of mountains or whatever. But most of them got in it because they just love the activity. And so while, yes, we sold to a lot of people, it was always based on sport.
Yes.
Sport was something I loved. Sport was something I knew was a commonality, not only within the local communities of athletes, but all around the globe.
Yes.
And there's a bond that you can have. And in today's world, you can put these things together because you have niche communities that are connected by internet or whatever. So even though there only might be in New Zealand, you know, 100,000 people that are on our program, you add that 100,000 to 1 million here and 500,000 there, you create a community that's quite different. So when we were starting, we were creating community physically that was out there. That became the challenge. But we then tried to do it by having expeditions, having people travel.
Yeah,
and that's cool. And what about some mistakes that maybe you guys made during this exploration of growth, for example? Did you guys saw something or tried a couple stuff that didn't work? Can you recall something that maybe were too big or that was a huge or a big mistake that we made trying to growth hack the industry?
Well, I don't think your podcast is long enough for the stories.
At least one. At least one.
But if you're not taking risk, you're not going to succeed.
Yes.
And some of your products fail. Maybe you don't fail in the marketplace in terms of physically working, but some people go, why did you do that? I've got stuff in my closet still that we designed that we thought was so cool, and it didn't work. And but a hot line is not necessarily 100% of everything sells. You do that. We tried to import boots because we knew boots would add into footwear because we didn't have the capacity to manufacture it ourselves, and it was great. And then suddenly interest rates were floated. Exchange rates were floated around the globe, and we were sourcing from Germany, and what was costing $100 now became $300, and it was impractical, so we had to cancel that. When we started manufacturing in China, we were worried about whether or not the quality would be the same. So we said, well, if we develop a second label, that would buffer us in case something happens. Well, turns out nobody wanted to buy a second label. If they came to North Face, they wanted to buy North Face. So we had to can that one and throw it away. So we did that. We certainly were of the belief that we would fail on or err on the side of failing because we're taking risk, because risk is how you break through. Risk, climbers don't try to eliminate risk. What they try to do is mitigate against them, and that's what we're trying to do in our business. And you could define it as having ropes or pitons or carabiners or whatever to be able to do it. But the reality is we would try new things, and Jeff Bezos probably said it best. He talked about his idea is what he calls the 2-pizza rule. He said with 2 pizzas, he said you start something so small that you can feed the team with 2 pizzas.
Yes.
Any larger than that, you won't ever cancel it. Yeah. And our idea was, let's try these new ideas. Let's see what we can do. Don't bet the ranch on it, as we say in the U.S. If it doesn't work, we get rid of it. And if you're only waiting to be perfect, you probably wait too long.
Yes.
And it's getting worse and worse on that bench because there's no time for perfect information any longer. Yeah. The accelerating pace of society is such that you have to make decisions without perfect information.
Yes.
And if you make no decision, that's the worst one, because no decision is a decision, but it's indefensible. Yeah. Now, you can correct if your decision is wrong, but making no decision allows the market or competition to take over from you.
How do you protect yourself of these taking these short time decisions of focusing on the products that that works and have good margins, and you motivate yourself and your team to try new things, even though you know that it can hurt margin and maybe waste a little bit time in trying to do something new, whether you should try to focus on the things that that works?
Well, it's a big challenge, and I don't think there's ever a perfect balance between them. But you start with the concept that there's a product life cycle. And if you don't acknowledge that, then you're going to lose. The companies that are all predicated on one product end up dying. Yes. And the example that I point out oftentimes is the Kodak company. And Kodak in 1998 had 170,000 employees. They're the digital photography company. Yes. Fabulous research. They had all the patents on digital photography. Yeah. And what they concluded was they were making so much money on photo processing of traditional things that they would just put the digital patents to the side. Yeah. 12 years later, they were down to 2 employees. Oh my God. And the only money they had was getting money on royalties from the digital patents. Those 2 people were patenting. Yeah. That's an extreme, but that happens. And the reality is you have to constantly be introducing new things. Now, all large companies, incumbent companies, resist that. And if you look at it, there's a direct comparison between the amount of innovation that gets to market and the size of the company. The larger you get, the less it gets there.
Yes.
Lots of research is done, lots of development is done, a lot of product development is done, but the incumbents have resistance to that. One thing goes to the point that you're talking about, but somebody said, why should you steal money from my product or my division, say if a product manager, why should you steal money from me when I'm paying the rent, I'm covering everything, to invest in something that is uncertain? We know 80% of new products fail.
Yes.
So you're taking some of the money that's there, you may be even affecting my bonus or my commission or my my salary to invest in those things. And what you find is usually because they don't have a strong enough person at the helm of the large company, they sort of divide the baby in half. They say, well, we'll give you a little bit, we're going to take a little bit away, but we're going to give you enough money to do it, where you have to have the audacity to say, okay, I'm investing and we're going to go there. And the answer is there should be constant experimentation. Now, the experimentation could fail from the standpoint that the market doesn't want it, could fail from the standpoint that it starts distracting from your corporate mission of what you are, because you're successful, G4, gosh, this is a great thing, we're just going to do this wonderful thing. We can do anything, we can be making barbecues, because everybody loves our name, but maybe that's not what people think of you. So, but you're going to constantly be torn between that. You're going to be torn between what some of your customers, your clients tell you, because someone will say, why don't you do that? And it's so, well, we can do that. We've got the people to do that. And so you have to take some bets. You have to narrow it down. I mean, the classic thing, and I'll kind of end the conversation on this, but with Steve Jobs. And Steve Jobs at Apple, he was kicked out of Apple. I don't know if you remember that.
I do.
He was a very uncomfortable person. But they brought him back in. While he was away, they hired somebody from Pepsi-Cola, John Scully. And Scully had great R&D. They were doing so much research going out. Well, they brought Jobs back in after he had gone to Pixar and whatever, and learned how to play well with others, and they brought him in, and he came in, developed the iPhone, or delivered the iPhone, delivered the apps and things like that. These are things that were percolating while he was gone. And in talking to him afterward, he said, how did you know which ones to introduce, going to what you were talking about? He said, well, I'm immersed in this business, so I think I have a pretty good feeling for what the timing is and the tenor is. He said, but I probably knew more than anything else is I couldn't do everything. He said, if I tried to do everything, we were never going to get there. So I knew I had to select. I probably left some things out that would be equally as impactful as what we're doing right now, but I had to deselect, be able to execute and carry it out. So the message there, the thing to learn from it is, when you're doing innovation, make sure you put enough resources against it to be able to make it work, to give it a valid test, do the testing, measure it, be open enough to cancel and kill something if it's not working.
And how do you know when is the time to kill the product? There is a timeline for this, or do you decide that on the budget, on the company? We're gonna try this for 2 quarters. If it doesn't reach at least this number, you're gonna kill it. How do you decide? I mean, the way you're thinking about this, that's what I want to extract.
Well, first of all, you have to set up what the metrics are and then have to measure against the metrics. It could be sales, it could be impact on brand, it could be a variety of things. But unless you have concrete things, you'll get creep. It's like, we kind of did that. It wasn't quite, we didn't, we thought it was going to be whatever. You have to say, okay, what are those concrete measurements we are, and get a number and get a date. If you don't, one alone doesn't mean anything, and put those two together, and then you say, okay, this is what we're going to try to accomplish. And one thing you might find is it's a great idea, but it's going to take 5 years, and your company needs something that's sooner or faster or whatever. And you say, well, that's great, but that might be a company that incubates. Have a number, have a date, have a goal set up, and they measure against it, and then be absolutely dictatorial about the fact we said we're going to get there and not do it. An example might be Elon Musk. Elon Musk put $100 million into SpaceX. And it was a lot of money for him at that time.
It's not almost everything he had.
Exactly. But now he's got a lot more. No personality, but he's got a lot more. But he said, that's it. that's all the money we're putting in.
Yeah.
They were weeks away from closing SpaceX down. And people coming to him said, well, you can use your reputation to raise more money. He said, I said, $100 million is what we're going to do. Either we get a launch off or not. And all the team said, we've got something great going here. We've got to get it done. And they figured out how to get it done within that time. Once they did the launch, they were able to attract capital at extraordinary rates. They were able to do things. Yeah. But I do believe that Musk would have shut that down even as close as they were. And you have to be that way.
One thing that I know it's a other industry, but something that Spotify does is, for example, if some feature is not being used by more than 2, 3, 5% of the users, they kill it. They just shut it down.
Yeah.
So that's they have the metrics. The metrics if the users are engaging with the feature, and if it's not working or they just
it's a good framework to think about as Klopp, as Hap said. If you have a date and you have a number, just follow this. I mean, but it's really hard. I mean,
but
the concept is cool. But when you're close to reach something, you just keep telling yourself that you're gonna reach the bullseyes. If you only 1 quarter more, and then this quarter more can kind of.
Well, you can
just this adjustment.
You can taste it. You can taste it. It's there. But a good thing about today is we have so much more data than we ever had that you can make these. You talk about what percent of consumers engaged. If you go back to prior to the area we're in right now, it was more by feel. How many people, how many people responded to an ad, and of those that responded, how many people do we think are really consumers? And you'd have your test to measure. Your test to be a year long or 2 years long. Today we've got A/B testing. You can do something in a week, and then you can use artificial intelligence to simulate and extrapolate to a great future. So I think it's easier today. It's easier to evaluate, but maybe harder to execute.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, because even though, I mean, the human material of today, I believe that's way harder to be managed than the human material that you used to have when you were the CEO. And I talk by myself. I mean, my team is great. I love my team. Guys here work a lot. They are super focused. They're really different of the average employee that I know in other companies, and I can say that with facts because we have over 55,000 companies as a client. So I know a lot of companies in Brazil. I know a lot of CEOs, and all of them say, "Hey, I love your team, man. You work so hard. Guys are here like every day, grinding, calling, trying to sell creative products and everything, and they care about the company." And I'm very lucky to have these people work with me, but it's not the rule. When you see all over the world, not just here in Brazil, young people doesn't want to work hard. They doesn't have ambition. They doesn't have a mission. They just want to have a little bit of money to create some pleasure moments in their life. They don't have they don't plan to get married. They don't plan to build a family. They don't plan to build nothing. They live for the only pleasure of today. So it's really hard to manage these people. How do you see this situation? Because I mean, you're an investor, right? Which is the kind of people that you usually invest today? What are you looking for when you're looking to invest in a business, for example?
I love that question. I mean, first of all, you don't have to hire everybody.
Yes.
And what you say and refer to is true, but it doesn't refer to everyone. You may have to be more selective. I've definitely seen an evolution. I think COVID exacerbated that, where some people said, well, work-life balance needs to shift, and I'm not going to do that. In the U.S., we have people wanting to do more remote and maybe not come in. And some of those people legitimately think they can produce remote. Some others legitimately think that, I can put an avatar up there and they'll think I'm in and whatever. But when you come back to it, the exciting thing right now is the same thing that excited me when we started the company. And that was I never hired people for their technical expertise. You need some of that now because the pace of change of society is faster, so you have to people who contribute day one. Yes. But what I was looking for was passion. A passion, in my case, for two things. One was for the outdoors.
Yes, sure.
The second one was to change the world, because that's what we thought we were doing. When you have a mission statement that is grander than everything, some people are drawn to that. Once you find those people with passion, then it's your job to educate them, my job to educate them, be able to do that. Yes. But without that passion, and I often tell people, and it sounds kind of hackneyed, but I said, I can teach business. I can't teach passion.
That makes sense. You can't teach heart.
Right. And then my advice, which I give to people that some thinks humorous, but I can tell you it's the best advice I ever gave to entrepreneurs, and that there's only one way to motivate people. And that's hire motivated people.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Makes sense.
That is a friend of mine, co-founder of Nubank, the biggest Brazilian bank, Cris Junqueira. I love that woman. She once told me that, you know what? I can teach you anything, but I can't teach you how to give a damn. So hire people that give a damn about your customers, right? Like something like you said, you can't teach heart. You can't teach people to have a purpose in life. I mean, usually we say that you hire people by the hardware, and then you try to insert the software, right? But without the right hardware, not gonna work. I mean, you can try to teach them, but they don't have the right passion, the motivation, the right hardware to execute things, right?
Yeah. One question about the something that you said. What do you mean about when you say change the world? What that means actually? If we can put in other words, what is that? Because the world have a lot of
changing, right?
Things to change.
Right.
But what is that?
What is changing the world for you?
Yeah, for you or for the North Face. What is this?
Well, at a 10,000 foot level, basically, I'm talking about reversing trends that we see in terms of the environment, in terms of people, in terms of degradation of things. At a more specific level, it's about ESG and focusing people on living sustainable life, taking care of things like the oceans, the climate change, and the environment. I saw it long ago. And, we only have one planet. I mean, maybe we'll colonize the moon. Maybe we'll be able to move to Mars.
Yes.
I like to travel, but I don't think that's the travel I want. If we don't take care of our planet, I don't know where things are going to go. And so this headlong direction towards consuming at all expense without thinking about the byproduct of it, that to me is what I mean about changing the world. And I also, behind that, is trying to inculcate an optimism, because we're living in this technological society where there's a lot of pessimism, partly because the systems are so large and so complex, kind of embedded in the question you asked, but that people feel paralyzed. Okay. They can't do anything. Yeah. And so part of what I want to do is insinuate the feeling that you can, and that one person can make a difference. The butterfly effect is out there if you do that. And a reason that I speak and travel and do things partly is to be able to pass that optimism on to people, because they look at me and they realize, if he can do it, anybody can do it, for sure. And as a result, if you start feeling that, then you don't feel that you're a victim of society. You feel like you're in control of society. Okay. Then I tie that to the ESG. If you're control, why don't you control those elements of it? Now, it's a butterfly effect. Okay. What one individual can do is probably individually not change the whole world, but either by your attitude, by your contact, by your influence. We can look at the pyramid there. There are people who are influencers changing the world. If I can influence them, I can't influence everybody, but they could influence other people, and they could influence other people.
That makes sense. I like the way you see life, Hap, because you talk about climate change, ESG, but you also talk about have an attitude, not, praise victimhood. Usually nowadays when people talk about ESG, climate change and everything, there is something in a pack that they pack together, the victimhood, like to create to polarize the society and split in two ways, the left wing and right wing. You don't seem to be like this. you seem to be focusing on one purpose. Yes, I believe that we should take care of our planet. I believe that we should take care of, your company to be more sustainable in everything, but don't be a victim.
Yeah.
Have an attitude of this. I would like you to talk a little bit more about the way you see life and the way you see that people, the people that defend some flags like climate change and everything. Do you think that's right to have this package together of victimhood together with this subject, or should we split the things and then focus only one mission, that the things that we want to realize, in this case, to be more sustainable and everything?
Well, it's Pollyanna, but I love John Lennon's Imagine.
Cool.
If you think that way, things could be there if you view it that way. And my brother is a bit more of a pessimist than I, and we argue sometime. And he said, "You're crazy because you're way too optimistic, and don't you see what's going on? This polarization, whatever." And I said, "Well, we're going to go through life,
yes,
and at some point the shit's going to hit the fan.
Yeah.
Up until that point, I'm happy. Up until that point, you're pessimistic and unhappy. Yeah. When it hits, we're both in the same place. But who's got a better philosophy? Mine, until we get there. And maybe I'll even be able to solve it because of the positive. Part of the feeling, I don't like all that division and whatever, because I don't think it's progressive. I know some businesses do that. They use that as a tool. They point to the competition and say, they're after us. It's Malthusian thinking in terms of, Malthus saying there's a limited amount there. Yeah. An example I have is pie slicing or pie enlarging. The pie slicers believe that it's a finite amount of food or whatever, and what you get, you take from me, or what I get, I take from you. The pie enlargers believe if we have a good enough idea and a great enough idea, we enlarge the pie and there's enough for everybody out there. Amazing. Yeah. And that is the sort of thinking I have, and what I try to encourage people to do. Amazing. So they don't get into that. And as I said, people oftentimes point to the competition as a way to do something, but if you point to a goal that's doing a lot less of the negative comes out. And so, if you can do that, I think you're going to be a lot stronger. And I believe in approaching it that way. Yeah. And there was a quote that I came across which sort of underscores that. And I had it on the wall of my office, and I put it in our design department at North Face. And the companies I advise, I now share it with. But it was a quote from the Mary Gloucester from Rudyard Kipling, in which he said, "They copied all they could copy, but they couldn't copy our minds. So we left them sweating and stealing a year and a half behind."
Amazing. Love this. I love this. Yeah. It's such a good quote. Yeah. And I love the way you approach the theme as well. Seriously, man. I mean, we need more people defending these flags with this kind of attitude. Not to split the society, but try to show the way they see the world, without trying to polarize the thing. Because at the end of the day, I believe that both sides, they want the same end game. They want a better planet. They want a better place. They might, disagree in how to get there. But what we want to get, I believe that people usually want the same thing, right?
I agree.
Well, one thing, you sold the company in 2000, right?
Yes.
So how was for you to sell the company after spend, almost 40 years building the company, building your dream, building your philosophy, and then you decide, it's time to sell. Why sell the company in 2000? What happened in that time that you decided to make the exit?
Well, I had some advice from somebody who was one of my good friends on the board. Okay. He said, you always said when it wasn't fun any longer, you'd get out.
You didn't have fun at that time.
And I wasn't having fun. And the reason was, I had a bad business model, really. We were growing so dramatically. You talked about that high growth. And everybody thinks high growth is, it's the end-all, it's panacea. It's going to solve everything. Yeah. The problem with high growth that we had is in the sports and apparel business, you can only grow about 20% a year on internally generated funds. And then what you have to do is either get equity or debt, And you kind of vacillate between one and the other. One year you're pushing the banks for more, and then they say that's enough. You got to get more equity and do it. You bring more investors in. You spend more time trying to keep them in line. Some people want to get out. Others, you're diluting, you're moving, all of that. And I loved building a brand. I love educating people. I love being in sports and the outdoors.
Okay.
I love product introduction, innovation, the whole process. And I was spending more and more time being a poorly
doing
paid
what you didn't love.
investment banker.
Okay.
If I wanted to be an investment banker, I should have formed an investment bank, right?
Yeah. Should go to Goldman Sachs, right?
Right, yeah, why not? Be smart about it. Don't do it. And so I was spending, each fundraising takes about 6 months
Yes.
to do a serious fundraising.
Yes.
You can get a little bit of money here or there, but 6 months to be able to do that. So every year I was spending at least half the year just on those things. And
Road showing, talk to bankers and everything.
And that wasn't what energized me. And so I thought, this is a time to step aside. Maybe there's a lot of things. I mean, as I told you, I was rigorous about this is how we're going to run our business. I was not so naive as to believe that there weren't other ways to approach business. So I thought about setting up my consulting company.
Yeah.
And when I set up my consulting company, I could advise in different ways, different companies, because they have different DNA, or they can do that. And it allowed me to do that, allowed me to do some of that. I also, I've written a couple of books, some because I like to give back, some because I like writing. One is on success, called Conquering the North Face. One is on failure, a company I tried to help in Silicon Valley. It's called Almost, 12 electric months chasing a Silicon Valley dream. But through the writing, I enjoy doing that, so I can do that. I do some teaching. I do teaching at Hult University. I do teaching at University of California, and some others, adjunct MIT, Stanford sometimes. But in doing that, I get back, but I get a lot of energy, and I get I keep on top of things.
Okay.
I wouldn't know nearly as much as I do about AI, about cryptocurrencies, about quantum computing, about all those things if I wasn't vital in there. So I was able to step by. And frankly, if I was running the North Face, I probably wouldn't have been able to devote the time to doing it. So, and then I have a segment at a time. I do investment, and I do serve on some boards, and I do some consulting. So I have a consulting company. I have sort of a speaking and educational aspect of what I'm doing.
Yes.
And then I have a fun time of my life.
It is, right? I mean, you deserve it. I mean, you spent so many years building a brand, building a successful brand, building yourself as a better leader. And now I can see that in your face that you want to give back to other leaders, right? That's why you probably write. That's why you're probably teaching and everything. And that's something that's really hard to see in other countries beside US, to be honest, because usually when you have a successful entrepreneur such as you, usually you write, usually you teach, you want to give back, you want to form another entrepreneurs, you want to mentor another entrepreneurs. It's not the reality in other countries. And I can see that. I can say that because I had a business that I expanded through 35 countries and I sold this business as well. So I knew so many leaders in a lot of cultures, and they usually say, yeah, I have no time to do this, to write a book, I just want to do the business and everything. When we started back then in 2019, when we started G4, the idea was this, like, I don't want to, professional teachers to be in the company, academics. I want entrepreneurs just like you, going like you did yesterday, going to the classroom and teach what you did, what you know, not what you studied about. And this could be so much help for the entrepreneurs, and that prove it to be more successful for these entrepreneurs that are already educated in academics, right? For these entrepreneurs that prove it more successful than to go to an MBA or something to build a business. I don't know if you agree with this, but this is something that I saw.
I'm a total believer in education. I think education is absolutely essential as we go forward. We're going into the knowledge economy, and if you're screwed if you don't have that education. But not everything is taught in the classroom.
Yes.
I mean, I have a masterclass series I do. We've done 20 of them with one of my co-colleagues, and the umbrella title of it is The Skills You Don't Get with a $200,000 MBA program.
That makes
because
sense.
there's things that so we do different segments each month. We come up with one, but the reality of going back, yes, you need to have real life input to be able to do it. Otherwise, you can theorize about everything.
Yes,
And and I know I've got some friends who always say, "Boy, I'd like to be just like you, Hap. I'd like to be an entrepreneur."
Yeah.
But there are people who academically look at everything and study all the reasons why something doesn't work.
Yeah.
You have to be a little bit crazy, like you are, and
you
I
as well,
am.
sir.
Right. And to say, I know there's an 80% probability that something's going to fail, and that's just exciting. I'll start this company with the 80% because I tend to have the hubris to believe I'm going to be the 20%. It's them that are the 80% that are going to fail. And if you listen to enough and you actually gauge the market and whatever, you can grow there.
Yeah, that's cool. And talking about again about the new generation, maybe for us both also. How would you encourage these new or these young entrepreneurs to stay resilient and work hard to accomplish what they are trying to do? Because as Tallis said right before, maybe because of technology, the speed of stuff nowadays, those folks they have some difficulty to endure. What can you share or inspire them to keep pushing?
Drink more beer.
I love that. I love it. Have a good time with your buddies, right?
Another thing is develop a network around you. A network that's supportive. There's some organizations that help. YPO is an example of such an organization. There's something called Entrepreneurs Organization, EO, that works that way. My son-in-law is involved in some chapters of that.
These communities, right?
Where people are facing similar problems to you are, because if you sit alone in your business and you're out there, and G4 helps in terms of what you're doing for people, but if you just sit out there, you have a whole bunch of problems. And the first thing, if you're naive and starting a business, you say, boy, things are going to get great as soon as I get to whatever X sales or turnover. And then you suddenly realize you have the same number of problems on your desk that you had before. It's just different problems, magnitude or whatever, and that can be debilitating. You can start going, oh Christ, am I never going to get out of it? But very few things that you encounter are absolutely novel. Most of those things that are dispiriting, others have encountered or they're seeing in a different way. And it's sometimes you have to get outside of your own organization, because if you're the leader and you tell everybody, oh my God, I don't know how we're going to survive COVID. That isn't a very good leader. What you've got to tell your team is, we've got it solved. Then you kind of come back to how are we going to solve it? But you've got to be the one that creates that inspiration out there. If you're talking with other people saying, okay, what are we doing? And somebody said, well, there's a government program that's going to give some subsidies. We did that. Here's an accountant that can help you file what's required. Somebody else is saying, listen, if you reformat your business just a little bit, in the outdoor business, for example, home gyms were a huge thing. Bicycling was a huge thing. And, you could focus on that. You could say, I'm in sport, but why don't you focus on the sports that really are done that way? And there are some solutions, but you may not see it inside your own company, and you may not be able to share it inside your own company. Maybe you can with a couple of partners, but if you share the whole thing, there's a difference between managing and leading. And when you lead a company, you have to be that inspiration. And some of those things that you talked about that are inevitable, that can wear you down, are ones that relate to leadership. The management is setting up KPIs, measuring how people get out there, and
that's horrible. That's horrible. I usually say this: don't do things that's horrible. Do things that you can't hire. You can hire a leader. I mean, you can, but maybe this leader not gonna have the DNA of the company as the founder have. Right. So being the front lines and being the sales room, for example, at the end of the month, we are nowadays in the last day of the not the last, tomorrow is gonna be the last day of the month. So we're gonna work tomorrow here till midnight. And I'm gonna be here Saturday night. And of course, my fiancé is not happy about this. But I don't give a shit. Because usually I spent the last few hours of the last night of the day in my sales room, selling with the guys, going to the front line, because this is the kind of general I would like to be if I were a general, right? Yeah. I mean, Alexander the Great, for example, he was known to be this leader that went to the front lines to fight together with the soldiers. Yeah. And that's why the soldiers admire him so much, and that made him to accomplish something unimaginable back then. I mean, at the age of 20-something, he basically governed the whole known world because he was always in the front line. He followed his words. Like he talked about to be resilient, to be fearless and everything, but he was in the front line fighting with each other, risking his life to show what means to be fearless, right? If you want to lead, you want to follow your words and do the thing that you're saying to your team that you have to do. Otherwise, you're just going to be managed, right?
Totally. And management is not inspirational. You know, talking about, you know, the only way to motivate people is hire motivated people.
Yes.
Well, you know, management is not about motivating people.
Yes.
And if you can threaten fear, you know, like if you don't make this quota, you're fired. What you find is you don't get great performance. Maybe you do for a week or two.
Yes.
But they're also at the same time polishing their resume, their CV. They're also, you know, talking negatively about you to your friends because the threats don't work long term. Yes. And what you need to do is have that inspiration of, why am I doing this? Why am I working till 12 o'clock on there? Why? One, because I said we're going to hit those goals, and I never miss my goals. Yes. And, you know, are you going to be with me? You're going to be out there at the front. You're going to be with Alexander when you do it. Yes. And I mean, it's fun when you do that. There are challenges today. As I said, some of the younger people are not finding business or whatever to be fulfilling. And the only thing I would say to them is, if you don't find that fulfilling, then why don't you find something else to do? Maybe you're an academician, or maybe you're an arts person, maybe you're a crafts person. I mean, you could do great things in that world that don't require what we have in business. But if you've thrown in business, don't say, well, I'm gonna kind of do it half time, you know, gonna do a little bit here and a little bit there. No, throw yourself in and get the joy of it, and get the joy of success.
Yes.
You know, I just wish everybody would have the same ride that I've had in terms of growth of a company, in terms of revolutionizing an industry, in terms of creating concepts that never existed before, and helping the planet, maybe in a small way, actually changing the world. If you think you can do that, that gives you some sustenance that you cannot get anywhere else.
Yes, that makes sense.
Yeah, great.
Mr. Hap, going to the end here. If you could synthesize the last decades of knowledge that you acquired by creating one of the most beloved brands in the world, what would be the advice that you want to give to the entrepreneurs that are hearing our podcast here? I mean, what are the main advice that comes to your mind when you're thinking about educating the future leaders, the future CEOs of the companies that are looking for creating something great?
Well, last night when I was speaking to your group at G4, I ended with these same things, which I'll share. One is a quote from a philosopher, German philosopher, Goethe, and which he said, whatever you can do or believe you can, begin it, because boldness has genius and power and magic in it. Try to start something and see what happens. Don't theorize, don't sit back, do it. And when you do it, it'll create sparks, and it'll create sparks taking you in directions you never imagined. So get off and do that.
Amazing.
The other one is kind of my own philosophy, which I distilled down to about 4 lines. The first one is, dare more than others think is wise. Expect more than others think is practical. Risk more than others think is safe. And dream more than others think is possible. If you do all of those things, you're going to have this electric feeling about you.
Amazing. Awesome. Mr. Hap Klopp, the founder of North Face. E eu vou mudar para português agora. Eu espero que vocês tenham gostado de mais esse episódio. Eu e o meu co-host, brabíssimo, Matt Montenegro, voltamos com o próximo Vox, quando aparecer um candidato tão interessante quanto o Hap Klopp. Senão, vocês ficam esperando aí, que vocês sabem que eu não entrevisto qualquer um. Valeu, turma.
Obrigado, pessoal.
Valeu.